Over the last few weeks, I've talked about my view that the God of the Bible's holiness, in other words, his difference or uniqueness, is his love. Love, the Bible teaches us, is not one of the qualities that God possesses, but his very essence. Love is not some minor attribute that sometimes characterizes God's behavior, but his essential being. Love is not a component part of God, but his very nature. God is love. So in that case, why do we sing so many worship songs about the wrath of God having to be satisfied by Jesus' death on the cross, and preach countless sermons based on the same angry God theme? Caricaturing all of this in an extremely entertaining episode of The Simpsons, Homer's neighbour, the Bible-thumping, church-going, staunch evangelical Ned Flanders thunders, "I don't judge you, I leave that to a wrathful, angry God to do." Of course, many, if not most Christians, learn to just live with this unthought-through dichotomy. On one hand, they believe in God's grace and goodness, but on the other, that one of the central acts of their faith, Jesus' death on the cross, is bound up in God's wrath and need for appeasement. However, for their friends and for the rest of the world, it's all just a massive contradiction. It's the elephant in the room. If it's true that God's anger could only be satisfied through the death of Jesus, then, in fact, the God of the Bible isn't unique at all. Instead, his thirst for blood is no different from that of countless other gods of the ancient world. Is a God who needs a bloody human sacrifice on a cross in order to forgive others any different from a God who requires that virgins have to be sacrificed on the slopes of an angry volcano that's threatening to erupt? And more than that, if this is what Jesus' death on the cross was all about, then God, it turns out, is a slave to his own anger, unwilling or unable to forgive those who've wronged or misunderstood him without first getting his pound of flesh. Defenders of this understanding of the cross, what's formerly called penal substitutionary atonement, penal referring to punishment and substitution to Christ acting in our place, explain that God is love, but he's also just, and therefore just can't allow sin to go unpunished without payment. But the obvious question is, why not? Why can't God do what he asks us to be able to do, to freely forgive without demanding retribution first? In what we know as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, his inaugural address, recorded in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, he teaches, "You've heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbour and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." But if God can't bring himself to forgive us without venting his anger elsewhere, and if the cross is a personal act of violence perpetrated by God towards humankind, but borne by his Son to appease his anger, it makes an absolute mockery of Jesus' teaching. If, as the songs and sermons teach us, God demanded a blood sacrifice because he was unable to extend forgiveness to us without it, then God himself is unwilling to follow the teachings of Jesus, which then all just become a huge case of do as I say, but not as God does. And this is exactly what the theory of penal substitution asks us to believe. Although Jesus teaches us to emulate God, who is, as he puts it in Luke's Gospel chapter 6, kind to the ungrateful and wicked, although he tells us that we should walk the extra mile and turn the other cheek and freely give without expecting in return, God just can't do the same. And it gets even darker than this. If God needs someone to pay the price for our sin, the question is, does he ever really forgive anyone at all? Just stop and think about it for a moment. If you owed someone £100 and they held you to it, refusing to release you from your debt unless someone else or until someone else paid the bill for you, in what sense did they really forgive the debt at all? Especially since, as all theologians should know, the very concept of forgiveness is based on the ancient practice of releasing a debt rather than collecting it from someone else, which is, of course, why Jesus, in the words of his famous prayer, taught us to pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." But at the very heart of the strange belief that God had to punish someone in order to forgive us is the fact that, if true, it implies that violence is, in the end, the only ultimate solution to injustice. And if that's true, all that Jesus taught about a commitment to non-violence as part of what it means to follow him indicates that far from being one, as he taught, with his Father, in fact there's a radical disagreement between Jesus and God the Father. In fact, in my view, penal substitution, although so often unquestioned by many within the church and simply regarded as what the Bible teaches, was born largely out of 16th century European Reformation thinking driven by the legal mindset of lawyer John Calvin, rather than reflecting the family-based framework of Jesus, who taught us that when we pray we should say "Our Father," not "Our lawyer." Over the next few weeks, we'll take a look at what I regard as other more biblical understandings of the cross. But for now, I want to leave you with these questions. How does your understanding of the cross influence your own attitude to forgiveness? Have you ever struggled to feel truly forgiven by God or by others? And if so, might your understanding of God and the cross be part of this struggle? God bless you.